Good day, we are Group 4 from Baps 33 and we are going to present to you the Diplomat and the Media.
The Diplomat and the Media. The basis of diplomacy throughout the ages has been person-to-person communication through the medium of envoys or ambassadors, but the term diplomacy relates to the study of documents and when considering the evolution of the various media of communication throughout history. Masabi nating maraming paraan ang media para makatulong o makahadlang sa diplomacy. Dahil ang media diplomacy has emerged as a foremost instrument of foreign policy and journalists are frequently and more intensively engaged in diplomatic matters to do and processes.
Misinformation is a form of deliberate deceit, a practice which is by no means new to diplomacy. Disinformations are false informations. It is spreading misinformations intentionally. Kumbaga, alam natin ang kabuuan at katotohanan pero sinadya pa rin maliin. Because of what we call purpose. Para saan? Para kanino? This is also known as biased informations o may pinapanigan kaya nagkakaroon ng manipulations of the facts. Propagandas, kung saan ipinapakalat ang impormasyon patungkol sa isang tao o bagay upang pabanguhin o siraan, ay matatawag na rin natin disinformations. Impormasyong binago, dinoktor, para sa pansarili o panggrupong kadahilanan. Misinformation is also the provision of a false image, but in this case without evil or deliberate intent. Informations na hindi sinasadyang mabago. Wala kang kaide-ideya na ang hawak o alam mong informations ay hindi sakto o tama. Ito ay madalas na nangyayari sa pang-araw-araw nating mga tao. May relate ko to sa buhay estudyante ko. Minsan ay nagtatanong ako sa mga kaklase ko upang makasagap ng impormasyon. Ngunit ilan nga ba doon ang sakto o real informations? At ilan doon ay misinformations? The major components of misinformations. First, technical limitations. Mga informations na nakikita lamang sa harap ng kamera. Palaisipan syempre sa ating mga tao kung paano naman yung mga impormasyong nakakalap off-cam. Kumbaga, ito ang mga informations na hindi buo. At ibinabahagi lamang sa mga tao kung ano yung gusto nilang ipakita. Selective perceptions and subjectivity. Personal perception of what is important, what is right, or what is wrong. Sarili niyang paniniwala ang siyang ibinabahagi niya sa iba. Ipinapahayag niya ang nais niya at hindi basta kung ano ang dapat niya i-report niya. Pinapahalaga niya ang sarili niyang opinyon sa tanong na tama o mali upang maka-impluwensya rin ang mga tao makakarinig sa pahayag niya. Cultural limitations. People of different regions and cultures become accustomed to judging certain countries or situations from a viewpoint. Of course, culture affects perceptions. How we perceive things is largely affected by our judgment skills, preconceived notions, attitude, and emotions. Our culture determines the structure of our thinking, which influences our perceptions on the good or bad. Iba't ibang kultura at iba't ibang paniniwala na naglilid sa misinformations. May mga salitang angkop dito at hindi angkop sa ibang lugar. Ang halimbawa narito ay yung salitang pabo na para sa atin ay ibon, pero sa mga Koreano, ang pabo ay stupid. Kapag ginamit ito sa isang salita o sa isang sanaysay, tapos makakarinig ay isang Koreano, magkakaroon na agad ng misinformation sa kanya. Personal political commitment is something that all producers will have, and perhaps without realizing it and certainly not intending it, they will allow it to influence their works. Dito nagsisimula ang political bias. At dahil sa sariling perception na isang reporter, pwedeng makaapekto ito sa gawa niya at sa report niya could lead in misinformation.
Ang media is one of the most important evolution sa and every country. So, dito sa dramatized reporting, dito pumapasok yung theater, ito yung mga concept ng art for art's sake. Ito yung mga major distortion factor. Yung pumapasok dito yung mga television producers, ini-aim nila na makapag-create sila ng good viewing and good theater. Siyempre, kapag nakapag-create ka ng ganon, siyempre, mapipraise yung mga fellow producers for being good in their job. Siyempre, dito rin mapapakita sa media kung gaano kagaling yung mga producers. And then, one of example nito yung docudrama. Ito yung extension ng theater to. Ito yung emotional experience, tapos ito yung mga legitimate contribution doon sa entertainment industry nila. Second, the post-fabric reporting. So, ang post-fabric reporting dito, minsan napoprolificate yung kung ano ang dapat ipalabas kasi sa post-fabricated reporting, halimbawa kasi hindi naman agad-agad yung reporter kung sa mismo pinangyarihan ng krimen or na kung ano mang event. So, syempre, minsan, napopost-fabricate yung kung anong dapat talaga yung information na dapat ibalita sa media. Minsan nadadagdagan, minsan nababawasan kasi nga sa mismong event na yon, wala mismo yung dapat na makasaksi ng bagay na yon. And third, the media law of demand and supply. Dito, so the media law of demand and supply. Halimbawa, inutusin ka na dapat sa araw na ito, kung ganito makalingap ko ng ganitong information. So, minsan, napabawasan, minsan napipilitan yung mga reporters na makagawa ng mga report na minsan kahit hindi importante, hindi naman ganun kahalaga, magre-report sila kasi yun ang demand and supply sa kanila. Kailangan nila mag-release ng mga bagong informations sa media na mapapanood noong tao. Ay, halimbawa, minsan, o kailangan ipalabas yung ganito, o kailangan 9 o'clock ipapalabas yung ganitong balita, ganito, ganyan. So, syempre, yung minsan hindi na rin naiisip nila na kung ano ba talaga ang dapat ipalabas, ano ba yung importante, ano ba yung totoo. Kaya minsan dito rin pumapasok na nadadaya yung information na dapat na nababasa ng madla. And then, next, the magnifier effect. Ito, sa magnifier effect, halimbawa, may insidente, nagkakaroon ng magnifier effect na. Kasi syempre, based on the impression na nakikreate ng tao base doon sa incident na nakita nila. So, dahil doon, magkakaroon na ng magnifier effect and magkakaroon na ng iba't ibang outcome kasi may mga tao na nakasaksi doon sa pangyayari na yon. Tapos, doon, makikita o ipapalabas sa media yung mga impressions na na-create dahil dun sa incident na yon. And then, last, you need to simplify, personalize, and demonize. Isa yung audience, syempre, dahil na rin sa media, may mga nakikita sila, may nasasaksihan, syempre, magkakaroon na rin sila ng enough knowledge kung ano yung mga nakikita nila, kung nakikita ba or hindi. So, minsan yung mga audience, they can more often easily identify with the individual politician than with the country. Kung meron bang conflict, kung meron ganito, at na-identify din nila yung good guy from the bad guy. Syempre, ang media, sinasabi ko nga important tool siya sa ngayon and na-create din before kasi dito mabilis na lumalaganap yung mga informations, yung mga infos na dapat malaman ng tao. Kaya ang tao, syempre, may knowledge din sila para ma-identify kung ano ba yung nangyayari sa kasalukuyan and they will able to identify the good guy from the bad guy and kung ano ba talaga yung mga informations na nangyayari sa surroundings.
The television interview requires careful preparation and analysis, and the diplomats must consider. So first is the interviewer's objective, why they should go to the interview. So ano nga ang reason kung bakit kailangan nilang mag-interview kahit minsan ay napapahamak na sila, and ano nga ang mapapala nila dito? Well, the answer is because of us. They need a story to fill the daily news, and it's their work to give us an information. Next is the diplomat's objective. Why should he agree to be interviewed? So, diplomats need to be interviewed dahil kapag tumanggi sila at hindi nagpa-interview ay maaaring maging cause ito ng negative feedback from the interviewer dahil maaaring may itinatago ito. So, if the diplomats agreed to the interviewer, they can provide news and information. So, ang interview daw ay dapat makitaan ng joint venture between the interviewer and the diplomats para pareho silang mag-gain sa interview na ito. Next is the circumstances of the interviewer. In order to work out a strategy, it is essential to know whether the interview will be live or recorded. So, dahil iba-iba ang type ng pag-i-interview, dapat ding alamin kung ito ba ay live or recorded para din mapili nila kung ano yung information na kailangan nilang sabihin or ilabas. Need din nilang alamin kung anong category ang lalabasin nito, kung ito ba ay sa news, documentary, talk show, or sa harap ng mga tao. And also, impromptu interview should be avoided. Next is the strategy of the interviewer. It is to obtain information and explanation. So, ang goal ng interviewer ay makakalap ng mga information na kailangan nilang malaman habang ini-interview nila ang mga diplomats. And the diplomat's strategy must be adapted accordingly.
Hi, I am Zandra Misi Rufo, and I'm going to present the rest of the topics under the television interview. The strategy of the diplomat. So we all know that the diplomats, they are the representatives of their country, and they must uphold a very good impression, not only on meetings but also on interviews. So for the strategy of the diplomat, there are a lot of things that they need to know. First is that they should be composed, they must be confident, reliable, credible, honest, reasonable, trustworthy, and warm. And some of the things that a diplomat must not do is to be ill at ease, hesitant, confused, dogmatic, or superior. The tactics of the interviewer. So, we all know that in a television show, they want entertainment or they want something exciting for them to produce for their audiences. And this is not something new in the industry. When a diplomat is being interviewed, sometimes these interviewers use different methods and strategies for them to exert something exciting and entertainment for their audience. First is they destabilize the diplomat, unsettle him, then provoke an indiscretion, lead him towards the subject he wishes to avoid. For example, are some issues about maybe the relationship of both states. Then get him to talk man-to-man from heart rather than his head. For example, is asking him personal questions that doesn't require him to reply using his intelligence but using his emotions. Then get him into a defensive state. And lastly is some interviewers use some tricks. For the reason is to produce good entertainment, such as pretending that the interview is over when in fact the camera is still running. So these are the different tactics of the interviewer which a good or great diplomat should pass through without being defensive or without being unsettled. The tactics and techniques of the diplomat. Of course, in different form of television shows, they have to achieve a goal, and that is to entertain their audience. And to entertain their audience, they use different tactics and strategies in order to provide this good theater. But in an interview, there is only a limited time. So if a diplomat is in this kind of situation where he is being provided with questions that he must avoid or he wants to avoid, then he can take advantage of the fact that the interview has a limited time. Of course, in the part of the interviewers, they must first give context or background to their audience before they answer or they question the diplomat. And without the allotted time, then the interviewers could not give context or background to the audience, therefore they couldn't ask the question to the diplomat. And the diplomat must take advantage of this limited time in order to not revert or respond on the questions he wants to avoid, and he must focus on answering the questions continuously and give key words or phrases for him to tell to the interviewer to continue. And of course, for the part of the interviewer, he wants the interview to be spontaneous and harmonious. So what the interviewer will do is to continuously ask questions and not provide the background information for some of the personal questions. And also, if a diplomat acts like a diplomat, then he will be treated as one. The diplomat's techniques is divided into two. First is the content, second is the presentation. Content, it is what he says, then the presentation is his body language, appearance, and the voice. Content. So we already know that the content means the things that will be said by the diplomat. And here are some major rules of content that the diplomats should know about. First is that analyze your audience and shape the content accordingly. So he must make sure to know what is allowed to say, and he must always remember that he is speaking not just for himself but for his country. Then he must go prepared, therefore unhurried. Of course, he must have the central message in his mind, and it must be his opportunity to put across it to the audience. And before the interview, he must write down all these phrases. It must be impressive, and it must also fit easily to what he is trying to give, or what he is trying to say to the audience. Next is that he must anticipate the questions that will be asked of him, and he must have a prepared answer. Of course, he must always be on the set of ideas and logic, and it must be easy to follow these sequences. And then try not to let the interviewer determine the course of the interview. Have his own plan of campaign, and he must not accept some topics, and he must not give assumptions. Then next is, do not only talk about negative points on that interview you may bring up. Put an emphasis on the positive aspects. Of course, he must put positive aspects in terms of his state, or even about some issues. Next is how lengthy should be the diplomat's answer. Of course, it must be long enough to maintain the flow of the conversation, but not too long enough to give the impression that he is wasting the audience and the interviewer's time. And then, of course, if an argument develops, what would the diplomat do? So, what the diplomat must do is that he must not argue. And he must not look hurt from the interviewer's manners. Next is, do not quote figures unless they are essential. Why? Because it confuses the audience, and he must not specify a number of points that he must not mention about, or then he are going to forget. If he are going to forget one, then he must write down any personal names and quotations that are essential. Next is that he must remember that the opening phrase and the closing phrase are very important. It is the first impression that will give and set to the audience, and the exit lines are what will leave the most lasting impression to the audience. And lastly is never admit that your government is wrong. He must never admit that, and never deviate from the fundamental sequence. And of course, very importantly, he must remember, listen, pause, think, then answer.
Boys, ang mga pangunahing katangian ng anumang estrahetikong salaysay na binubuo ng mga diplomatikong diskurso ay nasasangkot ng paghimok, pagpapakalat at pagkumbinsi ng mga diplomatikong diskurso ay sa makatuwid ay isa sa mga elemento na nag-aambag sa paglikha ng mga pampublikong imahe ng mga bansa at iposisyon ang mga ito sa mundo. Body language. Para naman sa body language, ito naman ay kumakatawan base sa iyong pinapakita at pag-aksyon sa katawan ng pampolitika na pang-international ang proseso ng diplomasya. The last is appearance. Pag sinabi naman nating appearance, ito ay bumabase sa itsura kung may mali ba sa diplomasya ng ating bansa.
Malayang ituring o isiping nagmamalabis kung ang pakay naman ng pagdaong sa bansa ay ang pakikisama at worldwide transparency na naglalayon o nagbibigay daan sa mga tao na makita ang aksyon sa kanilang mga karatig bansa. Hindi man natin may iwasan o ang mabilis na paglaganap ng impormasyon dahil nga sa teknolohiya na maaari nitong masilip ang mga butas sa gobyerno na maaari ding magamit o mabaliwala sa inaharap. Misinformation at disinformation ay maaaring magbunga ng hindi pagkakaunawaan sa hinaharap. The media may perhaps give diplomats the opportunity through the medium diplomacy to develop the skill of mediation to the point where existing intercultural animosities can be overcome. Kailangan din ng mga diplomats na magkaroon ng kamalayan sa media revolution, kaya sila mismo ang nararapat na sumabay sa agos ng information age. Muli, kami ang Group 4. Salamat sa pakikinig.